Hi everyone, and welcome to the Hands-on CISO podcast. My name is Adi, and today I'll be talking to Tammy Klotz, CISO of Trenzio. Tammy has over 3 decades of experience in the manufacturing industry, specializing in cybersecurity and transformational leadership. Tammy is dedicated to fostering teamwork, encouraging open dialogue, and empowering her teams to achieve shared goals. As an active contributor in professional circles, Tammy is committed to sharing practical insights and guiding organizations in today's digital landscape. Tammy, I'm super excited to have you here today. How are you doing?
Oh, Adi, thank you so much. I am doing amazing and I am looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you for this opportunity.
Perfect. So I think the first thing I'll ask you, you have such a resume in security. How did you even get started?
So it's actually an interesting story. So again, like most people, if you would have asked me 10 years ago if this was where I was going to be, I would have told you no. But I did spend 24 years in a manufacturing organization called Air Products, where I had a variety of different IT roles. And my last role there was actually a result of a tap on the shoulder that said, "Hey, we've got this opportunity for you in internal audit. Would you consider it?" And I was like, ugh, internal audit? Okay. So I stepped out. I took that opportunity. And honestly, it was probably one of the best things I could have done from a career perspective, because I learned so much about the organization, how the organization functions as a public company, what the board is interested. And then while in that role, we actually did the first ever cybersecurity assessment of the program at Air Products at that point in time. So that was kind of the first kind of toe dip into the security space, if you will. And then I was in that role for about 3 years. It was time to move on, and Air Products had hired a new CEO. They were spinning off their chemical division, and the new company was forming a new leadership team. And I had applied for a role on that team, which was not the CISO role. But the hiring manager came back to me and he said, "I want you on the team. I don't want you in the role you applied for. I want you to take on the CISO role and responsibilities for the new company." And I looked at him and I was like, okay, there's got to be more people that are more qualified than me. I've not done this before. And his wisdom to me at that point was a huge contributor to why or how I ended up here. So he said to me, "Look," he's like, "you know the business, you have relationships with the leadership that is coming with us, you know the audit language and the control, you're control minded. The rest of it we can figure out." Right. So while the company is still, forming, let's take some time, spend your time getting your certifications, figure out what all this means. And I did. So for the first year, I set out and got my certifications in security, my CISSP, my CRISC, and my CISM, both from Osaka. And, it was the pivotal point for me. So really matured in that role for about 3 years. And then had an opportunity to do the CISO role at another organization called Covanta, which is now known as Reworld, and spent about 3 years there. And just last October, I joined Trenzio, where I am now. So
That's so interesting. You've had the chance to see how it works in different organizations. Did you experience it as being overall similar, or does every company really have its own thing?
So, given that they were all manufacturing companies, right? So, there's definitely similarities, right? In manufacturing, there's an added component to the cybersecurity program, which is, making sure that the operations that are happening at the different facilities, at the different plants, are also properly protected from a cyber attack. Because oftentimes, in the event of a cyber attack in the manufacturing space, the impact from a business perspective can be much larger, right? Because, from a chemical manufacturing perspective, you're working with hazardous materials that could cause an explosion, those types of things. So different implications. So The programs themselves have been similar, but it does vary depending upon what industry you're in, what the risks are for that industry actually are. But more importantly, I think the other thing that's different as you go into a company is understanding where the maturity of the current cybersecurity program is, and how you need to improve that based upon the risk appetite of the organization. So that then becomes, the challenge of figuring out where we are and where we need to get to.
What affects the risk appetite of the organization?
So that's going to depend a lot on one, financial stability of the organization. It will also focus on things like innovation, and how much is the company wanting to kind of push the technology envelope and willing to take risks in that space. Other things could be, related to reputation, and what, willing or not willing to take on, from that perspective. And then, just operationally, those are typically the three levels of risk that come into play. But management style, culture of an organization, all of those things can formulate what your risk appetite actually looks like.
Interesting. And how does your day to day look like now?
Oh, that can vary. For me, most of the organizations that I've worked in have been between like $1 and $3 billion from a revenue perspective. From a people perspective, vary between 2,000 and 3,500, right? So that's the kind of industry size that I've been fulfilling this role in. And my teams themselves have been relatively small, in all three of those organizations. So I say all of that because my day to day can change dramatically, right? So it has varied from preparing board presentations to explain the cybersecurity program, where our deficiencies are, what we're working on. But it can swing the pendulum the entire different direction. And we'll be talking about like email retention rules, or we'll be talking about, document retention, and, how are things being properly destroyed when we're done with them. So the pendulum swings back and forth. And if it's a, not so much of a good day in the cyber world and there's an incident going on, then everything goes by the wayside and your focus is on that incident at that point in time.
Do you remember any specific incident that you experienced firsthand, and like how did you handle it?
So yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate that I haven't had to kind of live through a major cyber attack. However, there's definitely have been incidents that have caused a ripple effect across the organization. So, one of the more notables was with regards to an individual in the organization actually bypassing, probably inadvertently, the multi-factor authentication controls. She was actually getting constant prompts on her watch to accept or deny her MFA request, and she just got tired of it, right? And ultimately ended up hitting accept. But therein lied the problem, right? They were being persistent, that they accomplished what they wanted to, and she ultimately hit accept, and they had her credentials already. She then gave them the key to get in. So we kind of turned that into a learning opportunity for the organization, because people don't always appreciate what is actually happening inside the company. So I will often, turn those into learning moments to share with the organization at large, if these are the types of things that are actually happening here. Probably the other more notable one was the recent CrowdStrike event that happened just this past summer, right? That was not a cyber attack, but it was, a failure of a control from a software perspective, but it had a huge impact on the organization. So my role in that was really, leading the incident efforts, herding the cats, everybody that needed to play a part in getting us back up and running. And it's really about, formulating a plan, keeping everybody calm, focusing on the facts, and executing against the plan. So those are probably two that I would call out specifically.
That's really interesting. How much do you feel like your focus is on more technical side, like
Mm.
putting, say, walls up,
Mhm.
versus building a culture of security, of people asking questions, of people caring about it?
So I am definitely a non-technical CISO. And I think there's basically two types. You're either very technical or you're not. I am not, and I am very upfront and transparent about that when joining a new organization, because I view my role as the CISO to be a risk advisor for the organization so that folks can begin to understand what the cyber risks are and what the potential business impact is as a result of them. My goal is to build my team that supports me to be the technical experts, so that they can, design and implement the tools that are required to protect the organization.
Interesting. Was that ever something that you felt was um, like a disadvantage, or was it something that you were always able to work around, like the whole
So
technical side?
Yeah, so for me personally, it's not been a disadvantage, but I've had a conversation with some folks when they're either recruiting for a new CISO or a CISO has left the organization. There's definitely two schools of thought. If they want somebody to come in and be that technical person that can, do the building hands-on keyboard themselves, it's about being upfront about what your strengths are, right? And in those situations, I basically, if that's what you're looking for, I'm not your person, right? So it's really a matter of, understanding where your strengths are, and communicating that as such.
Interesting. So, as someone who's very much on the more human side of it, do you
Mm.
ever feel like you have to be a bad cop, like parenting sort of the company?
Oh, yep, that definitely comes with the territory, right? However, a lot of times what I will try to do is kind of switch that paradigm, right? Oftentimes, those of us who are security practitioners can be perceived as, the office of no. So, it's hard to work with us. They're just preventing us from getting our work done. They never let us do anything new. All of those types of, I've heard them all, right? So, what I usually do is try to change the dialogue, to understand, really focused on what the requirements are and what the business objective is that they're trying to obtain, and then talk to them about how we can mutually accomplish both goals to keep the company secure and introduce a new technology, right? So there's been a lot of that going on with, the whole onset of AI and, well, can we use it? Can we not use it? Well, you can use it if or this way, not this way. And developing and building those guardrails, so that people know how and what they need to operate within, as opposed to that constant no you can't, no you can't, no you can't, right? So but there are definitely circumstances that warrant, being the bad cop, and oftentimes people will say, well, you don't take on the CISO role if you want to be the most liked person in the organization, right? Because there are going to be times when you have to deliver bad news and be that bad cop.
It's really interesting. What would you say are the most frustrating things about cybersecurity, specifically the C?
Uh, yeah, the most frustrating things, I think, it again, it's going to depend upon the organization, right? And it's going to speak to the maturity of the program. So, if you have to build a business case with regards to why cyber is important, that becomes very frustrating, right? So it is part of the job to convince people of, why we need to be concerned. But sometimes it can feel like you're beating your head against the wall, right? Of, why this is important. And I've had I've had the 2 out of the 3 companies, I will say I did not have to deal with that, but there was definitely one company that I did, and it was really, there just wasn't a lot of visibility. There wasn't a lot of understanding about why this was important. And I think there's a lot of misconception sometimes that happens, whereas folks, they hear about all of the things that are, in the media, whether it's the Target breach, whether it's Home Depot, there's a variety of them that we can cite, but so many of them focus on like the personal identifiable information, like credit cards that have been hacked and obtained and on the dark web. And if you're not in the retail business, and you're more of a business to business organization, those don't relate, right? So you've got to identify those situations that do relate to your organization. Like for me, the Colonial Pipeline would be a more valid example in the manufacturing space, and why that impacts how they were impacted and how it could have impacted our organizations, right? So I think, sharing relevant examples is extremely important to help you manage your frustration, because otherwise there's just so much noise that needs to be distilled.
Interesting. How do you learn all the things that you need to know about on a
Mm.
like more ongoing basis? Because there's a lot of new things happening.
There is, this is a very rapidly changing landscape. There's always new tools that are being introduced, new technologies, new acronyms that are being thrown around, right? And the way that I tend to keep up with them, first of all, networking is huge, right? And everybody should make sure that they have a set of external connections that they can rely on and tap into, to ask questions of, are you guys using this new tool and is it working the way you expected? And then even going to events, and the security industry has tons of opportunity, right? I could go to an event every day, but I have a real job to do as well, right? So, but tapping into those sources, to understand what is happening, relying on industry experts, whether that's the Gartners or the IANs of the world, who are providing you that type of information. And then also, one of the things that I definitely encourage my team to do is making sure that they're out there exploring and investigating as well, because again, the landscape changes so drastically. I want them to be understanding what's new to market, how it's changing, the strategies and how you protect your organization. So I will always encourage my team to do that, as well as myself.
And when you do that, when you learn about new things, how
Mhm.
often is it that you learn about something and then you actually have to apply it to your situation versus how much is it more knowledge that's good to have and is interesting?
So the cop out answer is it depends, right? So, but if you have a particular problem that you're trying to solve within your organization, or there's a new attack vector that's coming into play, right? What are the new techniques folks are using to kind of protect or defend the organization against them? So one of the more common ones recently is around email security and how email is protected. And the historical and more traditional approach has been to use secure email gateways, that different products offer and introduce from a protection standpoint. But what's new? Like how is that changing? Is it evolving? So you may not be implementing something immediately, uh, but as that threat landscape changes, knowing what's out there and knowing if and when to make a change in your approach, I think is extremely important. And, so sometimes it's a matter of just, being a sponge and absorbing all of that and kind of tucking it away. Or if there's a particular problem that you're looking to address, it may be a more immediate type of implementation.
Hmm. What would you say are the biggest problems right now that you're seeing in the cybersecurity field?
So probably again, the hot topic is always around AI, right? And much like any other new technology, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad, right? So raising awareness around what you can and should be doing versus what you should and should not be doing with that new technology, I think is, kind of one of the first things that you need to get your arms around with. And with AI, you know, everybody wants to use it and it's a great tool and it can really help. But at the same token, to the extent that people are, if data is not properly protected and you're pulling in information that shouldn't be used in large language models, that's a risk that you're taking on for your organization. Or people are using AI to do more things, from more sophisticated phishing campaigns, or phishing emails, as well as like deep fake from a video perspective. So, that's another, situation where you really need to stay current on what those threats are and how things are evolving.
How do you see AI in general? Like, what are your thoughts about it?
So my my analogy is it's just like the internet, right? There was a point in time where we did not have the internet to help us do our jobs, right? So AI is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. So we can either embrace it and figure out how to adapt our work process and our work environment to accommodate it, or we can resist it to the point where folks start to use it, and then we kind of lose control of it altogether. So a really good example is, so when ChatGPT first became a thing, right, and it was all the buzz, and people are like, "Oh, are we going to block it? Are we not going to block it?" And I'm like, "Why am I going to block it?" Right? Because it's like telling your kids that they can't do something. They're going to figure out a way to do it anyway, right? So if I block it at work, and they're going to go home and use their personal PC for it, and now I have no visibility of that, right? So I tend to take a more of a hmm, uh, open-minded approach to some of that. So I definitely believe it should be embraced. I do believe the use cases for which it should be used in a business organization must be properly validated, and that the data that is being used and accessed is properly protected. So it's here to stay. It's can be a great thing. It can be a not so great thing. It really depends on who's using it for what purpose and what their ultimate end result is, or desire is, I should say.
Interesting. How have you seen the security field over the How have you seen the security field change over the
Mm.
past decade, and where do you see it going, like over the next 5, 10 years?
So, I think the interesting thing is at the root of everything we do from a security professional is that you must focus on your basics. I heard somebody talk earlier this week, and they actually used the phrase, be brilliant at the basics. And I love that, because there are so many things that, people may tend to overlook. And when there is an incident, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do to make sure you have the basic right overnight, right? So simple things like making sure multi-factor authentication is enabled, making sure you're using, complex passphrases to protect the organization. And then, figuring out how do you move from complex passphrases to password lists? What does that look like for your organization? I think, it becomes so important in the job that we do. And it is going to change. It has changed in the last 10 years that I've been doing it. But at the root of it is the fundamentals and those basic hygiene things that are will stick. We may do it differently, but those are the things that won't change over time. And I think, the things that will change is, staying ahead of the bad actors and the tools that they're using to get into organizations, and trying to stay one step ahead of them as opposed to 5 steps behind them, I think is part of our challenge. So
that's really interesting. How do you deal with the fact that you're sort of always on, like you're always ready for something to happen? If it happens, a lot of it is your responsibility to know how to deal with it. Like, how is it on a more stress level, and how does your team handle it?
Yeah, so that is definitely a challenge, right? You hear people talk about burnout from a security professional perspective, and I think it needs to be an intentional discipline so that when things are calm, you make sure that you're appreciating the calmness that is surrounding you at that point in time, because you're right. We never know when it's going to change. It could change at 12:10, in the next 2 minutes, if depending upon when people are listening to this. But it can change rapidly, is the point, right? And you've got to be able to switch gears, right? And go into more of a troubleshooting firefighter type of mode. So the balance for me is making sure that when it's not crisis mode, the pace is in such a way that it is not overwhelming or super intense, and making sure that your people are taking time for those other things to keep them balanced when it's not crisis time. The other thing that becomes extremely important is being thoughtful for, in the event of a crisis or an incident that is going to require 24/7 troubleshooting activity, how are you going to staff and how are you going to prepare your team? Because it is unrealistic to expect people to work around the clock 24/7. So how are you going to manage the handoffs? How are you going to distribute the resources so that you can do a continuous effort, while not, having folks succumb to tiredness, exhaustion, mistakes just because of the fact that they haven't slept for 24 hours, right? So those are the things you need to think about.
Interesting. What do you think is important for a person who's wanting to get into cybersecurity, or even wanting to advance and become more of a leadership management role in the field? What is important for them to know or to have?
So I would say, from a skills perspective, right? I think, and this is something when I coach and mentor folks who are looking to, either change careers, make a career move, it's really about, understanding what your core strengths are. Maybe not necessarily from a technology perspective, but think about things from a, troubleshooting perspective, a critical thinking perspective. What about, a resiliency perspective? So much of what we do in cyber is tied to being able to respond to a situation and come back from that situation. So I always encourage folks, when they're looking at job descriptions, don't focus on checking every box that's, in the list of requirements, because most likely nobody's going to be able to check all the boxes. But think about what makes you marketable to be able to fulfill a role in the cybersecurity industry. So, it's more like, I want to say, uh, not interpersonal skills, but definitely, uh, I'm at a loss for words, but less technical skills, more about those, overall skills from, a performance perspective, the troubleshooting, the critical thinking, those types of things. And then take a risk, right? You may not feel comfortable that, oh, I can do this, but if you can get the interview and you can convince them that you have the capability to do it, then you have to jump in and demonstrate how you can be successful.
It's interesting. I've heard a lot in security that there's there are people who are going into the field, but
Mhm.
there's still so much lack of people because it's like because the people you need are the people who have the experience, and then there's a lot of people who don't have any. How would
Yes.
you recommend facing that?
Yeah, that's always an interesting dilemma, right? Because you'll look at these job postings and they'll say, "Oh, we want somebody with 5 years experience or 10 years experience," and it's like, well, how am I going to get started? I can't get started if I don't have any, right? So my advice to folks when they're looking at that is, think about other ways in which you have perform jobs or held roles that allow you to practice skills that will make you successful in a responsibility. And as I actually talk to hiring managers and even HR organizations, sometimes it's challenging them to think about, is that really required, right? Because it does turn people away if they don't have the right number of years of experience. And think about, I'll say, compensating experience that may not be a 4-year degree, or maybe it's not 10 years of experience in an IT organization, but I've worked on the plant floor for 15 years and I know everything about how that system runs. Well, you know what? That's probably a really good candidate for me to consider to bring, because they're going to bring all that business knowledge with them. So it's the same thing when my CIO hired me into my first CISO role. Like I didn't check all those security boxes, but it's about the potential that somebody has to bring with them.
And on the other side of that question, is there anything that you see um, that CISOs should be thinking about or understanding more, or putting their focus on, not necessarily even in hiring, but
Mm-hmm.
in the things they think about?
So the one thing from a CISO perspective is it's super important for you to understand the business that you're protecting, because when you're going to get into conversations with the board or executive leadership, senior leadership, you want to talk to them about how a cyber incident is going to impact them. Where is it going to affect the business bottom line? I don't want to talk to them about technical details about access controls on a firewall. They don't care. They don't need to know. But if I don't have them, what's the potential outcome going to be? Or if I'm trying to get their buy in and support for a new piece of technology that I want to bring in, I don't want to talk to them about, oh, this, new cloud security posture management tool does X, Y, and Z. They're going to be like, yeah, so right, talk to them about what you're protecting as a result of doing that, and how we potentially can save money or prevent incidents as a result of having a tool like that in place.
Is there anything in particular that you've felt people outside of security just don't really seem to deeply understand?
Mm-hmm. Sure, right? I mean, you could say that about any industry, right? And I think the challenge there is that when you're brought in to fill a security role, you have a purpose, and your purpose is at the largest scale to protect the organization, which takes on a variety of different um, levels of things we have to do. But because it usually touches everybody in their daily work, because we may be changing their work experience, we may be asking them to do things differently, we may be preventing them from doing some things that they want to do. I think the key thing for me is making sure folks understand the why. You typically will have some security professionals who will not take the time to explain the why, and then it'll be, because we're security and because we said so, and this is how you're going to do it, and I don't want to even like entertain any questions about it. um, you can be on the other side of that, where I put myself is like, okay, we're making this change because this is why we're doing it, and allow them to ask questions for understanding. So I never want to be seen as the organization who is just pushing stuff out for the sake of security, but explaining why we're doing what we're doing.
Interesting. Do you remember any leadership or security decision that you made in the past that you ended up learning from, but wasn't necessarily the right decision at the time?
I do, that's all part of our growth experience, right? As we go through different things. And if we all did everything perfectly all the time, it just, we would not be being honest with ourselves, right? So there was a point in time in my career I was asked to make a technology decision, right? And I was asked to make the decision fast. We needed to save some money. So it's a classic example where, during COVID and Zoom became the tool of choice to do video conferencing with our employees around the world. Well, we had Teams now because we have Microsoft. So it's this debate. Do I use Teams? Do I use Zoom? Do I use Teams? Do I use Zoom? Make a decision, make it quick, get it done. All right. So we did. Right. Well, as a result of making it quick, there was, some oversight to, some of the different use cases that people were using Zoom for that I was just not aware of. Right. And as a result of that received some negative feedback and press. And also, there were some limitations of what Teams was able to do at that point in time. And as a result of that, there was, I'll say, a lack of acceptance that technology sometimes fails. And it's not going to be perfect all the time. And found myself in that situation where the technology failed. Teams did not do what it was supposed to do. And, in hindsight, I should have taken more time to understand where some of those deficiencies were at that point in time. What else was Zoom being used for that I didn't know about? Because on the surface, it was, quote, clear from a financial perspective. Why should we invest in tools? We already have one that we're using for other capabilities. So, that's probably one of the more notable ones that I can speak to, because you make a decision, you're asked to make a decision quickly. With that comes risk, and the risk is it may not be perfect coming out the gate.
Interesting. Well, I guess, hindsight is 2020.
Always, yes. So
Interesting. When you got into security, so you sort of stumbled into it, if I can say that.
Sure.
What made you even interested? Because it's very different than most other fields. And it's a field with also a lot of stress. It's a field with a lot of responsibility for the company's safety. What made you go, yes?
So if I think back to how I got here, right, it was actually what somebody else saw in me from a capability perspective that I would be able to do the role, and being willing to take that personal risk, to quote, give it a try. Right. And I think, therein lies part of the, what made me do this, why. I'm not sure I kind of totally thought through all of the implications. And it's definitely changed, because the CISO becomes this very targeted role in the event of an incident or a breach or when something happens. So, there is, some definitely hard consideration that you want to consider before jumping into the role. But, I think there's part of the intrigue that comes with that as well. And, by schooling, I have an education background as well. So for me, it's all about being able to educate folks about why this is important. And, one of the most satisfying things for me is when people start to see the light go on and they go, oh, That's why we're doing that, right? And making it personal for them, I think, is a whole nother component to this, because this not only affects people in their professional lives, cyber is pervasive, right? For everybody, from, family members to aging parents to children. So there's a lot of information that we can share, we can teach from a cyber perspective that is not only applicable to individuals in their professional lives, but also in their personal lives. So it's relatable. And that sometimes makes my job a little bit easier as well when I take it out of that business context, if you will. So that's definitely part of the intrigue. And I think the other thing for me, and I've only recently kind of made this connection, is, cyber resiliency is a huge thing, right? So we all acknowledge of, it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And then after that, that becomes, it's not what happened, it's how I respond to it actually happening and how my organization is prepared to respond to that. So, from a personal perspective, I've had several life events, we'll leave it at that, that have caused me to be resilient in my personal life. And I think being able to demonstrate that fortitude in those situations has also made me successful in my role as a CISO, because it is about how you respond to an event, being able to herd the cats, to focus on the facts, set the direction, and communicate clearly about what is going on. I think that's part of the appeal for me.
Interesting. Is there
Mhm.
anything that keeps you up at night that you worry about that you're
Um, people would, if she says no, what is she talking about, right? So yes, right. But again, one of the best analogies that I've heard about the security space is, it's kind of like brakes on a car, right? You don't put brakes on a car so you can go faster. You put brakes on a car so that you can stop when needed to respond to a situation that is actually occurring. So, there are things that we can't do it all, right? There's just not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough resources to do everything, to lock everything up like Fort Knox. So, protecting what I know about is, probably the easier part of the job. The thing that keeps me up at night is what I don't know about and what I couldn't be prepared for, right? And I don't, you don't know what you don't know. And there's other things too, like, who's going to click on, the link next or whatever. But again, I can't control some of those situations. So it's like trying to control the weather. I can't, right? So I've just got to be ready to be and be prepared for what's going to happen.
That's interesting. It's
Mhm.
a good response because in the end of the day, it is what it is, and it sounds like you've learned how to deal with it. I think so. My last question is, and before that, thank you so much. I loved talking to you and hearing like your perspective. I can tell that you have a lot of experience from different places and also a lot of energy. So it
Mm.
relates to sort of the last question I'll have
Okay.
is, so what would be your advice to people who are already in cybersecurity, whether CISOs or just people who are professional cybersecurity people, in terms of how do they educate their, well, let's say company employees or even any people around them? How do they
Mm.
create a culture of security? Because it
Mm.
sounds like you've been able to do that quite well.
So it's more of an art than a science, I believe, right? And it can't be done by carrying a big stick, and beating people over the head. I think it is the consistent reinforcement and awareness of what it means to an organization, right? So October happens to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month, right? So I've tried to, do things in all three of my companies that, people look forward to, whether it's, at my last company, we did a scavenger hunt during Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And it's really about dangling the carrot instead of yielding the big stick. How do you get people to participate? How do you get people to buy in? How do you get people to listen to you, right? And one of the things that I think makes it a little bit easier in a manufacturing industry is that safety is such a high priority for a manufacturing organization. And oftentimes the messaging that comes with safety is very parallel to what comes with security. So see something, say something, right? Stop, think, act. That's another one, right? So the messages are consistent. So the more that you can blend your communications along those lines, I think that becomes extremely helpful. And then, that culture is, again, it's about educating folks. And maybe that's why my education background, really, comes out in this role for me is, so many people will say, that doesn't happen here. Well, no, it does, right? And let me tell you about an example. And, sometimes that takes some hurdles to get through in your organization because people are like, oh, we can't tell anybody that. Well, no, we can. I'm not here to like name and shame somebody because they clicked on a link. It's more about, okay, so this is what happened as a result of this, right? And, sharing those examples to make it real to them, I think definitely, helps build that security culture and not make it, I just did a couple of sessions for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and a couple of the comments were all focused on, thank you for making this relatable to us, like making it not such a scary subject, right? And breaking it down and distilling it into facts and terms that we can understand. So, that is, I think, kind of the foundational elements to building a security culture.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and for everything you shared.
You're welcome. Excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Hopefully there's some key takeaways for our listeners today.